an asylum case, they should contact the Ministry of Interior directly, and then they would deal with particularly if it was a vulnerable case, they would then liaise with the department in question. I mean, effectively, there wasn't really a functioning system. It wasn't known, and it essentially was not accessible at all at that point.
Thank you. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all witnesses for joining us. Maddie Allen, can I just pick you up on one of the points you raised, which is around the nature of the journeys that are being undertaken now? I'm just wondering what your view is on how they've changed during the pandemic. So obviously we're focused on the boat crossings across to the United Kingdom, but across Europe as a piece.
Yeah, so we've seen, as is the nature of this inquiry, obviously a sharp increase in the number of people who are making this crossing by small boat in 2020. That has become the main way that people are crossing. And interestingly, in a previous evidence session, Dan O'Mahony, the clandestine channel threat commander at the Home Office, named 4 main reasons why he believes that change has happened, one of which was sort of unprecedented weather conditions in the recent months. Secondly, the coronavirus pandemic, kind of halting freight and aviation travel, and thirdly, a shift in global migration trends in general since 2015, and fourthly, protective security measures that have been put in place that have displaced people away from where the juxtaposed controls are. We have seen across Europe over the last 5 years a shift in the way that people travel. Obviously, it's dependent on route across the Mediterranean and across the English Channel. That is often done by small boats. But I wouldn't disagree with any of those reasons actually as to why we've seen this shift in the way that people are crossing. But I would maybe attach a slightly more longer term lens, particularly on that last measure, that last point around protective security measures. The UK's juxtaposed control agreements that have placed externalised the UK's border onto French territory has seen a huge investment in security at the expense of the UK taxpayer in Calais, predominantly at the Eurotunnel and at Calais port. And these measures where we see additional heat scanners, drones, fencing, dog patrols, have closed down what we see as sort of so-called safer, irregular routes. And this policy of border securitisation has had the opposite of an intended effect of what I imagine the Home Office and their partners that in the Ministry of Interior in France have been trying to do, which is to avoid fixation points. There's a very clear mandate from the state that they don't want to repeat the jungle camp of 2015-2016, the Sangatte camps prior to that. But what we therefore see is that the UK has kind of built a rod for its own back, and a Home Office official actually said in a previous evidence session, quote unquote, that it's driven people to the beaches. This is a situation that has been created over a number of years through securitisation measures that have been put in place.
Can I ask, do you feel that the journey across Europe has also become more treacherous during the pandemic? Or is it just the pinch points across to the UK?
We have seen this throughout Europe. This is there are increasing border violence and sort of the complete closure of borders, not that they were open, but the kind of closure of borders due to the pandemic, and obviously for necessary restrictions that were put in place by health authorities. But it's become incredibly difficult to make these crossings. So whether that's between Italy and France, whether that's between all of the internal borders of France, but throughout the Balkan route, we're seeing really heavy far-right presence operating, but also COVID restrictions on the Croatian border, on the Bosnian border, on the Serbian border. This is a journey that has become more difficult.
Thank you. Beth Gardner-Smith.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. I mean, we have actually seen that the movement of people into Europe through the main migration routes has actually dropped dramatically during what we think is as a result of COVID, most likely. So actually, if you look at the general population trends, we've seen really significant reductions in the numbers of people crossing via via the Aegean to Greece from Turkey, or via the land border there as well. We've seen an increase in those crossing to Italy, but it's not comparable. And therefore, actually, you do see that COVID has had an impact right across the board when it comes to the movement of people. Maddie mentioned the border between Italy and France as well, which is one of the routes that people take. And there we have seen pushbacks and illegal pushbacks in many respects of children who have their documents taken from them, or they're told they're not 18 by border guards who have no professional expertise, not children, sorry, who have no professional expertise to determine whether a child is a child or not. So, there are challenges for unaccompanied children right across Europe, but in general, COVID and just the general movement of people has decreased because of COVID.
And is it your expectation that we'll move back to the more traditional routes of travel as the pandemic lowers, the impact lowers?
I think it's very difficult to say, but I think, what we know is once a route is established, it becomes an established route. And so I wouldn't like to say that, once COVID restrictions have been lifted, once we see the movement of freight and lorries across the channel again as they were pre-COVID, you will see a reduction in the boats. I do think, as I said before, that the general confinement in France, the lockdown in France, has also had a combined impact on what we've seen, pushing people into taking these more dangerous journeys, because essentially the legal options, the few legal options available to them, have been closed down for a period of time.
Thank you. And Maddie, you talked about pinch points being created as a result of government policy. I'm interested what you think might be a better solution to managing this.
I think primarily, and Beth will go on to this in more detail, but whilst we have these juxtaposed controls in place, and we have placed the UK border on French soil, without a safe or legal route of passage to be able to make that journey, these irregular or illegal journeys, as they're described, are the only option. So, we have to create safe and legal routes of passage, but combined with that, there are a number of things that can be done to improve and work collaboratively with the French authorities to improve conditions on the French side. The conditions that people are living in, the complete lack of adequate child protection systems, which I can go on to, the lack of adequate reception centres and spaces in accommodation centres. This can be worked on. I think in relation to inadequate shelter, it's interesting. We have a team of human rights observers who are present during these police operations. And just to throw a few more figures, in Grand Stanth in Dunkirk, they were present, so these figures are through 2019, they observed sheltering operations. So this is where buses arrive to take people off to reception centres where they can initially have respite, but then secondary, enter the French asylum system. And out of 148 days per year where that was available, 2,453 people presented themselves at the allocated bus stop wishing to be sheltered. And over half, 1,345 people were turned away. 53% of those people turned away were families. So these are people who are wanting to access accommodation, wanting to access safety and protection in France, and there is inadequate provision in place. So I think there are a number of solutions to this issue. It's not solely focused on there is no one solution to this. We have to have safe and legal routes of passage, but we also have to end the systemic police brutality that we experience and witness in northern France, alongside improved accommodation options.
Thank you. Beth Gardner-Smith, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of points to pick up on there. I mean, one of the interesting things that I think we saw, picking up on this idea of safe and legal routes, but also encouraging people into the system, is that with the DUB scheme that closed earlier this year, we know from the centres, from the children's centres in northern France, from Saint-Omer, which is one of the main shelters just outside of Calais, that actually what Dubs did was not just provide a safe route for a specified number of children, but it also encouraged children to come into the system. So actually they saw it as a really important child protection, because so much of the job and the battle is to try and encourage children who have been under the control of smugglers. I don't know whether that's...
But we'll just try and fix the technical... Try again now.
Okay. I don't know what you heard, but essentially, I was saying that actually actors in France saw the Dubs scheme as a really important child protection tool when it was in place, because what it did was encourage unaccompanied children to come into the system. Actually, not all of those children would end up being transferred to the UK, but they were there then in a shelter long enough to be talked to by qualified social workers, to be, in many cases, then persuaded to stay in France and claim asylum in France, because they'd had long enough with those children outside of the informal settlements, outside of the control of smugglers in many cases, to then, actually do the really, difficult work of persuading these children, encouraging them into a system that they deeply distrust because of their treatment and their experiences along the route. So it's just one example of why safe and legal routes to the UK are really important. They're really important for those people who have a really, a reason to come to the UK and a valid reason to come to the UK. But they're also important as a child protection tool, as an opportunity to sort of encourage people into the system as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Lawton.
I thought that last point was really interesting about the success of the Dove scheme. So what you're